Today I'm making some chairs and modifying an existing stool for my Gryffindor Common Room. I'm taking a semi-handmade approach and starting with this House of Miniatures kit. This kit comes with enough pieces to make 2 chairs. The side pieces are too square for my liking, so I'm using some sandpaper to round the edges. I had to learn the hard way, but you should support skinny pieces like this when you're sanding so you don't snap them off. Sandpaper or an emery board works just fine if that's all you have, but I'd like to make it go a little bit faster by using a cheap metal file I got from Harbor Freight. A lot of viewers comment on how patient I am, but I'm actually impatient and I don't like tedious tasks, so I like to make little things like this go faster by using the right tool. When comparing the 2 pieces, you can see how sanding the edges makes the side of the chair look more realistic and in scale. The top of the chair is squared off and it's not part of the instructions, but I'm rounding the top as well. This chair is supposed to be assembled like this with these 2 pieces on the back, but I'm modifying the chair. Instead, I'm using the thinner piece at the top and this larger piece at the bottom, and I'll be adding spindles in between the 2 pieces. I was initially planning to use fancy toothpicks as my spindles, but I found these tiny turnings I got at Earth and Tree Miniatures. Since I'll be using these chairs in my Gryffindor Common Room project, I'd like a look that's more elevated and looks more antique. Of course, if you don't have these, you can go ahead and use toothpicks. I'd like the spindles to be more securely attached, so I made a hole starting with a smaller bit and then using a larger bit to prevent splitting the wood. I'm holding the top rail of the chair side by side with the bottom piece to try to get the holes to align so the spindle in the middle won't be crooked. Adding holes like this only took a couple of minutes, but it'll make the spindles a lot more secure than it would if I just glued them to the surface in between the rails. If they're just glued in, they could easily pop out at some point. I'll be adding 3 spindles, so I added 3 holes to each of the rail pieces. Now that the holes are added, I'm carefully sanding the edges, making sure I don't sand in too far, but also taking away the harsh edges. To trim my tiny turnings, I rolled them back and forth underneath my X-Acto knife and then snapped it. I dry fit the pieces together to make sure they work, but first I have to stain these before I assemble the chair. When I'm painting or staining tiny pieces, I like to stick them to a piece of tape to corral them. I'm using some watered down Waverly Antique Wax as stain. I like this stuff because it's water-based and it has no odor. It really gives the look of stain, although you could also just use watered down acrylic paint. I'm applying the wax and wiping away the excess before it has time to dry on the surface. To assemble the back, I used a tiny amount of glue in each of the holes. I like to apply the glue with a tiny precision tip bottle, but you can also use a little pile of glue and a toothpick to apply it. White glue or wood glue will work well for this. I was pretty careful with my glue application, but there's still some glue on the surface. I decided to stain the pieces prior to assembly for this very reason. Anywhere glue squeezes out would have resisted the stain, so there would have been pale spots. I'm using a needle to remove the excess glue. I'm assembling the chair by attaching the seat and the back rails and then capping off the other side. The instructions from the kit suggest allowing the glue to dry before moving on, but I assembled the entire chair at once. It did fall apart a couple of times, but if you're persistent, the little bugger will stay together. Once it was assembled, I added an extra bead of glue on the top and bottom of the seat to make it more secure. The upholstery will cover this later. You could leave it just like this, but I will be adding the upholstered seat. To attach my little piece of foam to the cardboard, I'm using a glue stick. Glue sticks seem to be relegated to elementary school, but I like to use them frequently, especially if I'm attaching something to a paper product. I'll be using this chair in a really rustic old space, so I added some lumpy hot glue to the surface to try to make the seat look less perfect. I used a poorly executed gift wrapping technique to upholster the chair. To reduce bulk, I cut away the corner piece. So the pieces hold immediately, I used hot glue. I started by wrapping each of the sides of the chair seat. When it came to wrapping the front, I folded the front over, but I got hot glue all over my seat. If I was more patient, I could have used a fabric glue or Fabri-Tac to prevent this issue. To cover up the hot glue edge, I hastily made a piece of trim by folding a skinnier piece of fabric. First, I folded it at the top and then at the bottom, so I'll have 2 finished edges. I was planning to use this piece to disguise the hot glue I got all over the seat, but then I got hot glue all over this piece as well. But since the castle is an old space, I'm telling myself this is fine and it's just wear from the students over the years. I really like the light tone of the wood, but the Gryffindor Common Room has much darker furniture, so I'm mixing up more of a mahogany stain. It's handy to know I can change the color of the antique Waverly wax by adding acrylic paint, so I can create a variety of different shades of stain. I tested the color on the bottom before committing. For the second chair, I sanded all of the pieces and assembled it according to the instructions. I tried to use the layout sheet to get the proper placement of the back rails, but it didn't work very well. The paper wasn't flat enough, so the back pieces kept popping off, so I just eyeballed it and assembled them on my desk. For this chair, I took my chances and assembled the chair prior to staining the pieces. I cleaned away the excess glue, but there were still pale spots where the stain was resisted. Fortunately, this is going in a rustic space, so I mixed up some watered down black and brown paint to cover these pale areas. I'm sealing the chairs and adding a bit of shine using wax. Don't go running out and buying this product because I'm just using it from a leftover Pinterest project from 2015. You could seal your chairs with polyurethane or even Mod Podge. I applied the wax, let it dry for 15 minutes, and buffed away the excess. I used a different technique for the second upholstered seat and it worked a lot better. I started by gluing the foam to the cardboard surface just like the first chair. I'm upholstering this seat with this fabric I got from Bentley House Minis, but I'm using the back to avoid the color on the front. This time I started by attaching the fabric to the back of the chair. Instead of cutting away the excess fabric at the corners, I folded over the fabric like this. This made the seat a little bit thicker, but it still works well. I left overhang on the front so I can fold all of this fabric over the front of the chair. I think this looks more sophisticated and it's a lot easier. I glued it to the underside with hot glue. I'm using the ugly hot glue cushion on the simpler chair. During my collaboration with Bentley House Minis, she not only made me 2 chairs for the Gryffindor Common Room, but she sent me extra bits, fabric, and this little stool. I used my new heat gun to remove the top of the stool so I can reupholster it. I softened the glue using my heat gun, but this was actually a risky venture because there was plastic-based foam underneath that I could have melted. I always keep my heat gun moving, so fortunately I didn't ruin the foam. I'm adding some tufting to this piece and I'm starting by making a pattern. To avoid measuring or doing any math, I cut a piece of paper the same size as the seat I'm upholstering. I folded the piece of paper in half lengthwise and in thirds. I attached the piece of paper with a glue stick because I will be removing this and glue sticks make it really easy to pull off later. I'm marking where the folds intersect so I know where to drill the holes for my tufting. I started the holes with my small drill bit. I don't want the paper to become too attached, so I'm separating them now before they spend too much time together. These holes are too tiny for my needle to pass through, so I made them bigger with a larger bit. To execute the tufting, I laid the piece of fabric over the top and put the needle through the back through the hole. I'm securing the thread on the back using some hot glue so it doesn't pull all the way through. I brought the needle up through the hole, placed the bead, and pulled it tight. The fabric is firmly attached in the middle since there are 2 beads going through it, so I secured the edges with some more hot glue. The top looks great, but the bottom is a hot mess, so I cut a small rectangle and glued it to the bottom to hide all of that. This is the same velvet fabric Ava from Bentley House Minis used to make one of my chairs. She aged the fabric by coating it, so I'm making up my own mixture using some watered down glue and brown paint. Before reattaching this piece, I sanded the stool to remove some of the shine. I'm just lightly scuffing the surface to add texture rather than trying to remove the color. I recoated the stool with some matte Mod Podge. I inadvertently softened the wood glue on the side of the stool earlier when I was using my heat gun to remove the seat. So now I need to reassemble the stool, including the side piece. I'm using hot glue to attach the top portion and wood glue on the bottom piece. The hot glue holds the upholstered piece immediately, and the wood glue will hold it all together over time. Check out this video next to see my collaboration with Bentley House Minis to see all the items I made for her and the 2 chairs she made for my Gryffindor Common Room project. I made over 20 minis in this video, so it's definitely worth a watch or a rewatch.